The present purpose is to illustrate how to evaluate internal evidence relative to text variants in the process of textual criticism of the Hebrew Scriptures, trying to figure out what is the better reading after having evaluated the external evidence. In short, this especially amounts to a careful and close consideration of a multiplicity of biblical details. It's especially important to get at, broadly speaking, contextual issues. That is, what sorts of connections, both proximate and in a larger framework, could be related. Things like grammatical and linguistic situatedness and the shape of things and other tendencies also can be taken into account. One of the decisions that needs to be made is, could this be by accident, or is this on purpose? And those decisions turn on a variety of factors. And if we are thinking that it could be an accident, we need to explain it. It's not adequate to just say it's an accident, but what factors in the context could have led to this accidental scribal variation? In the case of an intention, we can't prove motive, but we have to think through the potential motives that could explain scribal improvements. And that's the way to look at this. The scribes were trying to do a good job, not corrupt the text. So what would have motivated them to improve the text according to one or the other of the very readings? This would include considering grammatical improvements, harmonistic improvements, theological improvements. There could be others, but these are some of the main ways that scribes improved the text that they were given to try and do well at their job. And then finally, it's especially helpful to also work with some commentaries or other secondary literature on the variant that you're working with. We need to do the work for ourselves and think through it for ourselves, of course. That's the nature of good exegesis. But it also helps to collaborate with some of the commentaries available to us. To evaluate the internal evidence for the variants of Deuteronomy 32:8 can begin by summarizing external evidence for the last phrase of Deuteronomy 32:8. Now the verse speaks in the first 3 lines about the Most High dividing humans, nations, peoples. This refers apparently in the poetry to the narrative in Genesis chapter 11 of dividing the peoples by the languages. And the question at hand then is, according to the number of what? And that's where the variant comes into play. And the main witnesses look at a couple of different things. The Masoretic tradition says it's according to the number of the sons of Israel. And this matches what is found in the Samaritan Pentateuch as well. Yet, the Qumran biblical texts include a fragment that reads according to the number of the sons of God. And this corresponds to the oldest witnesses to the Septuagintal reading. Now, of course, the majority Septuagintal reading, which is apparently an early change, switches over to the angels of God. And we've already decided, based on external evidence, that this is probably an early scribal gloss within the LXX tradition itself, a euphemism to sort of soften the blow of the potential liabilities of speaking about these sons of God or lesser deities. So this is basically what's uncovered in examining the external evidence. Now we need to evaluate this to see what is the more likely, better, or original reading. A good place to begin may be with the commentary on the apparatus of the BHQ. And here there's a comment on the reading in the Masoretic tradition, B'nai Yisrael, sons of Israel. And the editor seems pretty confident that this is not the original reading. That verse represents a deliberate emendation for theological motives, is reasonably certain. And the editor goes on to describe a quite extraordinary circumstance involved in this particular scribal improvement or scribal variation. The suggestion is made that there's a series of additional corrections that needed to be made to the Masoretic, the Proto-Masoretic tradition in order to do this emendation. Specifically, it required more than the convictions of an isolated scribe to have affected 5 further interrelated changes. And then he cites his source. The 2 primary passages here are in Genesis 46:27 and Exodus 1:5 of the Septuagintal version. These say that 75 members of Jacob's family went with him down into Egypt. And this stands in contrast with the 70 members of Jacob's family that went down in these 2 passages according to the MT witnesses. The mentioning of verses 20, 21, and 22 refers to adjusting some of the subtotals in order to match the new number of 70 that went down with Jacob to Egypt. The claim that's made here is that by changing the number of the nations to the number of the sons of Israel required also changing the number of the family of Jacob that goes down into Egypt, I guess the sons of Israel, broadly said, also to 70, so that the biblical text could harmonize with the poetic text in Deuteronomy 32. All of this brings up the question, well, why 70? The logic of this proposed set of scribal adjustments is in order to coordinate or to harmonize the biblical testimony. So specifically, since Genesis 11 speaks of dividing up the nations by languages, and since Genesis 10 has a list of some 70 nations, thus they need 70 languages. And so then this would mean that Deuteronomy 32:8, when it speaks of dividing up the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel, would require that Israel has 70 sons. And so the suggestion of the BHQ Deuteronomy editor is that Genesis 46 and Exodus 1 are both corrected to 70 in Jacob's family to corroborate the connection of how many nations were divided up in Genesis chapter 11. It is worth noting that the BHQ apparatus on Genesis 46 does not speak of this connection. It talks about the variant between the 75 in the Septuagint and the 70 in the Masoretic text, but doesn't explain it with reference to Deuteronomy 32. I'm just going to have to leave that off to the side, but it's also something worth picking up. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan of Genesis chapter 11 shows part of the same logic here. The plus is in italics. Then the Lord said to the 70 angels that stand before him, "Come, let us go down." So that is taking advantage of the plural pronoun used in Genesis chapter 11 to make this sort of connection to the 70 angels. And then this is corresponds to the pluses in Deuteronomy 32 in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, namely when the Most High gave the world as an inheritance to the peoples who came out from the sons of Noah, when he divided the writings and the languages among mankind. In the generation of the division, at that time, he cast lots on 70 angels, the leaders of the nations, with whom it was revealed to see the city, and so on. So here we find the sort of logical connection for the rationale to connect Deuteronomy 32 with Genesis chapter 11. Interesting is that there's also the further connection of the number of the 70 souls of Israel who went down into Egypt. But sort of in the background of this is the connection to the 70 angels and the 70 languages. This, of course, doesn't prove anything. This just shows how the logic between Genesis 10 and 11 and Deuteronomy 32 was worked out even by ancient interpreters. And what are some of the other potential motives for deliberate scribal improvements? And here we can get some help from Tigay's commentary on Deuteronomy. Tigay offers several explanations, including these three. One, the scribes may have wanted to guard against the idea of lesser divinities dividing the nations according to the number of the sons of God. That is, this also helps guard against the potential for polytheistic tendencies among scriptural readership. That is, the scribes, ironically, were worried that the biblical revelation could give people bad theology, so they corrected the Song of Moses in order to guard people to get the right conclusions. And Tigay also very helpfully includes together with the discussion of Deuteronomy 32:8 the similar proto-Masoretic adjustment in Deuteronomy 32:43. I'm going to have to leave that aside. The external evidence in that case is considerably more complicated, but noticing that twice within the Song of Moses there's a very similar kind of adjustment really strengthens the idea for why the ancient scribes would have made these deliberate changes. And Tigay also connects this whole idea to other examples in Scripture. For example, in Psalm 29 verse 1, B'nai Elim, sons of God. When this passage is recycled in Psalm 96, the psalmist makes an adjustment himself from B'nai Elim to families of the peoples. And of course, Psalm 96:7 is further recycled into the song in 1 Chronicles 16, who continues to use the newer, upgraded version of families of people. So again, within the scriptures themselves, we see that the scriptural writers sometimes had some concerns for why they may have made some adjustments when they're paraphrasing or offering an interpretive quotation from earlier traditions. Looking further at either Psalm 96 and or 1 Chronicles 16 would be helpful, but I'm going to have to leave it aside for the present purpose. The ancient scribes who copied the scriptures may have been concerned about the old Canaanite traditions. For example, in the Cycle of Baal myths, the section that's about the palace of Baal, there's actually a piece in there that speaks about how Baal invited the 70 sons of Athirat to a feast. And so that sort of connection between the old Canaanite pantheon and their sons of the gods, that sort of creates a real danger for some of the connection during the diaspora when the scribes are thinking about people reading the scriptures. So that could provide a motive for wanting to improve the text and make it less susceptible to drawing bad conclusions and strengthen monotheism. The Net Bible is available online and contains within it a large number of very helpful text-critical notes. Now, in this case, when they evaluate the evidence externally, they're dealing with the MTs, B'nai Yisrael, sons of Israel, and they do note that Qumran has sons of God, yet for the LXX, they don't use the older reading, but the later change within the Septuagintal tradition, Angelon Theou, the angels of God. So that kind of explains what they're doing in their explanation here. Now, they also concur that the sons of God is undoubtedly the original, yet they say that the MT and the Septuagint have each interpreted it differently. By that, they mean that the MT tradition takes the sons of God to be the sons of Israel, or the Israelites, whereas the Septuagint, again, this later Septuagintal tradition, takes the phrase sons of God to refer to the angelic assembly. And they go on to make a few other comments to that effect. The point here is this is a good commentary on text-critical notes, text-critical situations that can help us think through the internal logic and consider various potential motives of the ancient scribes. Weavers, who translated and did the editorial work on the Göttingen Critical Eclectic edition of the Septuagint, has also written a commentary on the Septuagintal text, and that has much helpful information when we're considering difficult problems. And he writes, the MT then has a different notion than the Septuagint's sons of God. The Most High has fixed the boundaries of the people in accordance with the number of the Israelites. It is unlikely, however, that this was the parent text of the LXX translator. In fact, it would be much easier to understand an original B'nai El being changed to B'nai Yisrael for theological reasons. Weavers here makes an excellent point. What he's suggesting to illustrate that it's difficult to accept that the ancient scribes may have deleted Elohim and replaced it with Yisrael. That seems to be a bit radical of a change, even for scribes willing to make these changes. Rather, he suggests a lesser adjustment. Perhaps if the original was B'nai El, then the scribes would only need to add 3 letters, Yod, Shin, Resh, to create sons of Israel. Very interesting, because here he's getting at the psychology of the scribes, where they want to make an improvement, but what are sort of the limitations on what sorts of improvements ancient scribes are willing to make? It's a very good point. Crawford spells this out a bit further. And again, Crawford's not inventing this idea from scratch. Rather, she's working with sort of expanding on the implications of the Biblia Hebraica suggestions in BHK and BHS, along with Weaver's and perhaps others. And what she gets at is, if the original was Bene El, then that explains the main witnesses pretty easily, because that would explain Huion Theu, sons of God, in the Septuagint. It would also explain, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they may have wanted to spell out not El, but Elohim. And so in this case, we even have the plene spelling of Elohim, so sons of God. And at the same time, taking the same observation we just saw in Weaver's, that the scribes of the Proto-Masoretic tradition could have merely added a few letters to get B'nai Yisrael, the sons of Israel. So this is, again, Crawford's really thinking through how to explain all of the evidence that we have looking at the external variants and the witnesses to the text. After examining the external evidence and evaluating it, and doing an examination of the internal evidence and evaluating it, we need to make a provisional decision. And it needs to be provisional because we want to continue to think through these things, but we need to preach, we need to teach, and we need to continue on. And oftentimes, we'll use two guidelines to help us, namely, the shorter reading may be the more original, or the more difficult reading may be the more original. Now, these are not rules, but more like, as the pirates say, they're more like guidelines. And so in this case, neither one of these really works as far as explaining the external or internal evidence. So these are just general principles that work sometimes, but our examination of the external and internal evidence really is pointing in different directions. So here's three sort of ideas that fit with a provisional decision of what we've been working on. Firstly, the Masoretic text seems to represent scribal improvement to the sons of Israel for theological reasons. Seems to be the motives and a good way to explain what we have in the Proto-Masoretic tradition. Secondly, the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls evidence look like they represent an original reading of either B'nai Elohim, sons of God, or B'nai El. And one thing to remember here in Deuteronomy 32:8, well, if we look at the A line uses the term El Yon. Now, if that connects with the D line, we can see how the A line could have when Elyon divided the humans according to the number of the sons of El. Again, without the A line being Elyon, Elohim seems like a better choice, but it does seem like B'nai El, even though there is no extant evidence, it does also logically fit with the A line being the most high, and then the D line could be the sons of El. But really, we need to probably keep it that we don't have evidence. The best evidence really probably points more towards Elohim, but again, thinking through the logic of the scribes, that points to the possibility of B'nai El. It's difficult, but that's kind of a toss-up in this case. And then one further connection for sort of the exegetical implications of our text-critical work is that B'nai Elohim, sons of God, in Deuteronomy 32:8, seems to correspond to the let us of Genesis 11. And it's worth noting that There is a similar use of the plural pronoun by God when his attendants are present, at least in Genesis 3 and Isaiah 6. Now, the one outlying one that will require more attention is Genesis 1. However, it is worth noting that the poetical tradition in Job 38 does have the sons of God present, praising the Lord when he is doing his creative acts. All of this is sort of further exegetical connections that can be made based upon doing the text critical work in Deuteronomy 32. In all of this, the interpreter should follow the evidence, be patient, and really take the time to think through, based upon evidence and internal connections, what's the most likely, more original or better reading.